My name is Eleanor Roberts. I'm 72 years old, a widow for just over 2 years now. After my husband passed, I thought I'd have the comfort of family around me, especially on days like my son's birthday. For years, I had taken such care in planning events, preparing meals, arranging the house just right to make everyone feel welcome. But that day, everything changed. I remember feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness as I set the table that morning. The house smelled of fresh bread and apples from the pie cooling on the windowsill. I had spent hours choosing the perfect tablecloth, folding napkins with little paper rings I made myself. It was going to be a lovely gathering, at least, that's what I thought. I waited quietly in the living room, adjusting the cushions on the sofa, listening to the soft clicks of my tea kettle boiling in the kitchen. The cheerful chatter of guests arriving faded in gradually as they found their seats, the clinking of glasses and laughter weaving into the familiar soundtrack of family celebrations. Yet, beneath the surface, I noticed something off. My son, Jake, didn't smile as warmly when he caught my eye. His wife, Emma, barely glanced in my direction. When I moved to take my seat at the head of the table, the place I had carefully prepared for him and for me, he snapped, his voice sharp and cold, like a knife slicing through the room's warmth. "Get out of here, I didn't invite you," he yelled. I stood frozen, the fork in my hand suddenly feeling heavy, my throat tightening. The room fell silent as every guest turned their eyes toward us. I stared at him, feeling the sting of those words, but also the disbelief that this was happening under my own roof, my house. Slowly, I stood up, a flush warming my cheeks. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell back. Instead, I walked to the front door, every step deliberate and slow, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside me. My hands trembled a little, but my spine was straight. I opened the door and looked back at the stunned faces gathered inside. And then, something inside me snapped. I did something that shocked every single person in that room, something I'll never forget. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just about a birthday party being ruined. This was about respect, about dignity, about finally standing up for myself in a family that seemed to have forgotten who I was. Have you ever been in a place where those you love turn against you? Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? That's exactly how I felt. The betrayal was raw, thick in the air, and I couldn't breathe. It wasn't always like this. My son used to call me every Sunday, no matter what. He'd laugh and share stories about his work, his hopes, his little girl. We'd sit for hours over coffee. But slowly, those calls became less frequent. The conversations shorter, colder. The first odd thing I noticed was a missing photo from my mantelpiece. Just a small family picture, slipped off without a trace. I thought maybe I moved it myself and forgot. Then one afternoon, I found my jewelry box slightly ajar, a ring missing that I'd never lent out. I told myself I was imagining things. But the feeling settled into a quiet dread. That day at the table, when my son yelled at me in front of everyone, it confirmed my worst fears. Something had changed, and I didn't understand what or why. As I closed that door for the first time that evening, I knew I couldn't just sit back and let my family push me aside. I had to uncover the truth behind the looks, the silences, the cold shoulders. To understand what happened next, I need to take you back to where this all began. 3 weeks before that dreadful birthday, life felt so different. I was still carrying the grief of losing my husband, but I kept busy in the little ways that gave my days meaning. I spent mornings in my garden, pruning the rose bushes my husband planted decades ago. The flowers smelled faintly of lavender and earth, grounding me in the memories we shared. Afternoons were quieter, often spent knitting or reading old letters that reminded me of better times. I knew my son Jake was busy, juggling his job and family, but I hoped we'd still find moments to connect. Those weeks felt normal enough on the outside, but there were subtle changes I couldn't ignore. When I called Jake, his voice sounded distracted, hurried even. Sometimes he'd cut the conversation short, promising to call back, but never doing so. Emma, his wife, was polite but distant when I bumped into her at the grocery store or family gatherings. I told myself maybe they were both just stressed. Still, an uneasy feeling settled deep in my chest. One afternoon, I noticed something odd when I entered Jake's house, unannounced. The door was unlocked, which was unusual, and the living room looked freshly cleaned, almost too clean. The couch cushions were turned just so, the coffee table cleared of its usual clutter. My heart pounded with the thought that something was off. Had they tidied everything up because they expected me? Or were they trying to hide something? I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just being overly cautious. But as days passed, small incidents began to stack up, like grains of sand gradually filling an hourglass. There was the time I found my favorite tea set moved from its usual place in the cabinet. The delicate cups, a gift from my mother years ago, were stacked in a way that suggested someone had been searching for something. I asked Jake about it the next time we spoke. "Oh, Mom, I must have moved it cleaning up," he said without much interest. "You know how Emma likes everything spotless." But I wasn't convinced. A few days later, while helping Jake in the kitchen, I overheard Emma speaking on the phone in a low, urgent whisper. They were discussing finances, figures and budgets that I didn't recognize or understand fully. But what caught my attention was Emma's tone. It was cold, calculated. I waited a moment too long and caught the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. My blood ran cold. At home, I found letters addressed to Jake, hidden in a drawer. Bills, foreclosure notices, and what looked like notices to cancel services I didn't even know they'd subscribed to. It was as if someone was quietly dismantling parts of my life, piece by piece. That night, I sat by the window, watching the street lamps flicker outside. The house felt colder than usual. Shadows stretched like fingers across the walls, and the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I began keeping a small journal, noting every odd thing I noticed, every missed call, every uncomfortable glance exchanged between Jake and Emma. My hands would tremble as I wrote, the weight of suspicion pressing down on my heart. Friends noticed my growing anxiety. "Martha, you look worried. What's going on?" my close friend asked during one of our weekly tea afternoons. I hesitated, then confessed my fears. Martha listened carefully, her hands warm around the teacup. "You're not imagining things, Eleanor. I've seen families change like this before, when greed and pride ruin what should be love." Her words stayed with me. I realized I needed to be more than just watchful. I needed to gather proof. So the investigation began, not with a magnifying glass or hidden cameras, but with patience and quiet observation. I paid attention to phone calls, to what Jake didn't say, to Emma's sudden interest in managing more aspects of our finances. One afternoon, as I was reorganizing some papers on my own kitchen table, I noticed one of my going-out dresses was missing. A casual thing to overlook, but for me, it became a sign. I asked Jake casually, "Have you seen my navy blue dress? The one I wore to your graduation?" He frowned, the irritation flashing across his face briefly before he masked it. "No, Mom. Maybe you lent it to someone." "No, I didn't," I replied quietly. It was a small moment, but it added to the growing pile of unanswered questions. All the while, Jake's behavior became more unpredictable. Sometimes he was distant, barely making eye contact. Other times, when Emma was around, he was sharper, more dismissive. At one point, he told me I was overthinking things and that I should let go of the past. But his eyes didn't meet mine, and the hesitation in his voice betrayed his words. It was in those moments I felt the most isolated, my own son trying to push me away as if I were a stranger. The first major confirmation hit when I found a list, carelessly tucked under a magazine in Emma's car during a rare moment she left it unlocked. I couldn't believe my eyes. My jewelry, my grandmother's silverware, the old china set, everything was there, itemized and oddly priced, like a garage sale catalog. My heart broke as I traced my fingers over those names, realizing something terrible was unfolding right before me. To make matters worse, I overheard a conversation between Emma and a neighbor, one that was meant to be private, but wasn't. They spoke in hushed voices about how to best manage Eleanor and making sure she doesn't get suspicious. The realization hit me hard. All this time, my family had been plotting. I wasn't the beloved mother or grandmother anymore. I had become a target. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the moments in my head, the smiles that never reached Jake's eyes, Emma's icy stares. The betrayal felt like a sharp knife twisting in my chest. Despite the pain, I knew I had to be smart. I couldn't let them win without a fight. So I reached out for help. Martha offered her friendship and a sharp sense of protection that I desperately needed. She put me in touch with a private investigator, someone discreet who could help me gather solid evidence without alerting Jake or Emma. As the days passed, the tension mounted. They grew bolder, making careless mistakes that only confirmed my suspicions. I watched from a distance as they manipulated finances, lied to friends and family, and kept weaving their web of deception. But I was readying myself for the moment when I would confront them, when I would take back control and demand the respect I deserved. Have you ever felt like you're living in a house filled with shadows, unsure of who you can trust? That's exactly how I felt. The people I raised, loved, and nurtured had turned their backs on me. But little did they know, this story was far from over. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was very wrong, so I decided to dig deeper. I started small, reticent at first, afraid I might be wrong about the suspicions growing in my heart. But every visit, every conversation I eavesdropped on, every piece of evidence I slowly uncovered confirmed my fears. They were not just excluding me, they were actively working against me. One afternoon, I hired a private investigator. I hadn't planned to, but desperation drove me. I wanted truth. What he found made my head spin. My own son and daughter-in-law had been meddling with my finances, secretly taking out loans in my name, forging signatures, redirecting my pensions. It was like watching my life being dismantled piece by piece without my knowledge. My hands trembled when I saw the documents spread out on the kitchen table, the forged papers, the bank statements full of unauthorized withdrawals. I recorded every conversation I could, capturing every damning word from whispers about liquidating assets and cutting ties. I felt like a detective in a mystery novel where the villain was none other than my flesh and blood. Emma became bolder too. They thought I was unaware, that I was too old, too weak to resist. She started to gaslight me openly, making me doubt my own memory. "Mom, you're confused. You don't remember things right," she said one day, her voice sweet but cold. "Maybe you should rest more. Let us take care of things." But I wasn't falling for it. Jake's voice took on a harsh edge I hadn't heard before, commanding and often dismissive. "Sign these papers," he insisted one afternoon. "Today, Mom. It's for your own good." I looked at him, my heart breaking, but my resolve hardening. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not signing anything until I understand exactly what's going on." They started spreading rumors, telling neighbors and distant relatives that I was ill, forgetful, losing my mind. It was a cruel attempt to isolate me, to undermine my credibility. But in the quiet of my room, I planned my counterattack. I wasn't going to let them win. I reached out to old friends, allies who could help me before it was too late. Martha Sinclair has been my rock through all this. She helped me find a good lawyer, someone who understood the delicate situation of elderly people betrayed by their own families. Bit by bit, I gathered more proof. Photographs, recordings, even witness accounts from neighbors who had overheard the shouting and threats. The betrayal was more extensive than I feared. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, domination, and cutting me out completely. Late at night, I would sit by the window, the cold glass pressing against my cheek, eyes darting to the street below. The house that once held laughter and love now felt like the setting for a cruel drama. But in those moments of solitude, I found a quiet strength. I was no longer just the passive victim. I was a fighter. What would you do if someone you trusted turned against you? If your own family plotted to erase you? Would you stay silent? Or would you find your voice and roar back? I decided I would roar. And with every bit of evidence I collected, my plan came closer to fruition. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between us grew unbearable. Jake avoided me at family gatherings, his smiles tight and forced when he had to nod in my direction. Emma's casual glances held an icy challenge, daring me to say or do something that would give them an excuse to cut me off completely. One afternoon, news came that shook me to my core. Emma had filed legal documents seeking power of attorney over my accounts, claiming that I was incapacitated and unable to manage my financial affairs. My breath caught in my throat as I read the formal letters. This was no longer subtle. It was an open declaration of war. I called Martha immediately. "They're trying to steal your independence, Eleanor," she said, her voice steady but filled with concern. "We need to act fast." We met with a lawyer who specialized in elder law and family disputes. He explained the options, the proofs we needed to gather, and the possibility of court intervention to protect my rights. I listened carefully, trying to absorb the flood of legal terms. It was overwhelming but empowering. I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for my dignity, my identity. The hardest part was facing Jake. When I confronted him about the paperwork, his expression twisted into one of anger and wounded pride. "Mom, do you want to make this harder on yourself? Just sign. It's for your own good," he pleaded, almost desperate. I looked him in the eye, my voice calm but firm. "My son, I am not giving up my life and my voice to be silenced by fear or greed. This fighting spirit is what I inherited from my mother, and it's not going anywhere." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. It felt like losing him all over again, but I refused to be broken. At home, I found myself surrounded by memories. The photographs of us when Jake was a boy, the birthday cards he sent me every year. I traced his face in the albums, wondering when the love had turned into bitterness. But then, I reminded myself, love doesn't mean allowing yourself to be diminished. Emma ramped up her efforts too. I began receiving strange phone calls, silent, filled with heavy breathing, or messages that disappeared before I could read them. The house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a battlefield. I installed locks, changed my phone number, and leaned on friends for support. Martha was unwavering. "You're stronger than they think, Eleanor. You'll get through this," she told me one night over tea. With Martha's help, I organized my evidence meticulously: bank records, witness statements, recordings, and photos. Each item was a brick in the wall I was building around myself, a shield against their attempts to erase me. One afternoon, amidst the chaos, I received an unexpected visitor, my granddaughter, Lily. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Grandma, why does Mommy say you're not supposed to come to our house anymore?" she asked quietly. My heart broke. How could I explain such adult betrayals to a child? I hugged her tightly. "Some grown-ups make mistakes, darling, but Grandma will always be here for you." That moment steeled my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for me anymore. I was fighting to keep my family together, to protect the bonds that still mattered. I knew the day was coming when everything would come to a head. The confrontation, the truth laid bare in front of everyone. But until then, I prepared. I stayed vigilant, sharp, and hopeful. Have you ever felt so alone in a fight you thought you would never win? I have. But I also learned that sometimes standing alone is the first step to reclaiming your strength. The tension inside the house became unbearable, a constant electric charge in the air. Every look, every word between Jake and Emma hinted at secrets meant to exclude me. but I refused to disappear quietly. One evening, Emma invited a few family friends over under the guise of a casual dinner. I wasn't initially invited. When I arrived unannounced, my heart pounding, I could hear the murmurs through the door, the kind of whispers that cut deeper than any shout. They spoke of me like I was already a ghost in the family, questions about when Mom might lose control or how to get her to sign over her property. I stood there in the dark hallway, my breath catching as the weight of betrayal pressed down. But instead of retreating, I took out my phone and discreetly recorded the conversations. In these moments, I realized I was becoming something I never wanted to be, a warrior. But sometimes, warriors are forged from heartache. The next day, armed with more evidence, I confronted Jake again, this time in front of Martha, who stood firmly by my side. "Jake, this has gone too far," Martha said, her tone steady but stern. "Your mother deserves respect and dignity. We have proof of financial manipulation, lies, and exclusion. This ends now." Jake's facade cracked. His anger erupted, but so did his hesitation. For a moment, I saw not the estranged son, but the boy I once knew, the one who needed guidance, not to be pushed away. Emma, however, remained cold and calculating, unwilling to admit fault. But the room was no longer theirs. It belonged to truth and justice, for me. Over the coming weeks, the family dynamics shifted. Some relatives distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others expressed sympathy and support. The lawyer worked swiftly to place protective measures on my finances, preventing further abuse. Though the wounds would take time to heal, I reclaimed my voice, my power, and my place, not just in my family, but within myself. Looking back, I see that day at the birthday table, the moment my son yelled at me, not as an end, but as a beginning. The beginning of a fight for dignity, for love, and for justice. Have you ever faced a betrayal that broke your heart, but also sparked a fire inside you? That's the story I'm living now. A story of pain, yes, but also of strength and hope. And I'm just getting started. After months of gathering proof and preparing myself mentally and emotionally, I knew it was time to take decisive action. I wasn't just fighting shadows anymore. I was about to confront real enemies, my own family who had betrayed me in the deepest way possible. With my lawyer's guidance, I began the necessary legal processes. We notified the banks about the forgery and unauthorized withdrawals. I asked for certain powers to be legally restricted, preventing them from taking any further control over my assets. Each step felt like reclaiming my stolen dignity, brick by brick. But the fight wasn't without danger. Emma and Jake grew more desperate once they realized I wasn't backing down. Emma's messages became more frequent, cold and warning, sometimes downright hostile. Jake's once polite phone calls devolved into curt commands and thinly veiled threats. "You don't want to make this messy, Mom," Jake warned through clenched teeth one evening. "Just let it go." I took a deep breath, my eyes steady. "You want messy? Then get ready, because I'm not letting you erase me quietly." My friends rallied around me. Martha never left my side, and my lawyer worked with patience and precision. We set up meetings with financial advisors to secure my holdings and prepared for the inevitable court battles. During this period, Emma tried a new tactic. She spread rumors openly, whispering to my social circle that I was confused, that my memory was failing. It was a brutal attempt at isolating me emotionally, but I refused to be diminished by their lies. Instead, I strengthened my support network. I connected with local elder advocacy groups, went to counseling sessions, and reached out to others who had faced similar betrayals. The solidarity gave me courage. One day, I confronted Emma directly. She was at my front door, acting all sweet and conciliatory. "Mom, we're only trying to help. Please don't make this harder on yourself," she said, voice dripping with false concern. I looked at her calmly. Help or control? Because those aren't the same. She faltered for a moment, then her mask slipped into frustration and anger. "You don't know what you're doing, Mom. You're making a huge mistake." I smiled faintly. "No, Emma. The biggest mistake was underestimating me. My plan was coming together. We had gathered recordings, documents signed under false pretenses, witness statements. The evidence was irrefutable. Yet, the emotional toll was heavy. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, the magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a wave, knocking the breath out of my lungs. It was heartbreaking to think the people I loved most could try to push me out of my life. But every time despair crept in, I reminded myself, this was not just about losing money or possessions. It was about reclaiming respect and self-worth. At one point, I nearly lost hope. Jake refused all communication, and Emma's legal team was relentless. I found myself doubting whether justice could truly be served. But then Martha visited me with news that lifted my spirits. "They're cracking, Eleanor. They can see the walls closing in." I knew the final confrontation was close. So I prepared for the moment when everything would be laid bare, when truth would confront lies with the full force of evidence. I invited Jake and Emma for a family meeting, my family's last chance to make things right or face the consequences. In those quiet moments before the storm, I sat in my living room, feeling the weight of everything behind me and the uncertain future ahead. But this time, I was ready, not a scared old woman waiting for fate. I was Eleanor Roberts, a mother, a widow, and a fighter who would not be silenced. What would you do if the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally betrayed your trust? Would you fight back, or would you let them win? That night, I committed to fight, not just for myself, but for every woman who has ever been pushed to the sidelines. The day I'd been dreading and waiting for had finally arrived. I was ready for the family meeting I had called, and I knew they couldn't ignore it this time. My home had been silent for days, the air thick with anticipation. I arranged the living room meticulously, folding the chairs I rarely used, clearing every trace of fear and replacing it with quiet determination. Jake and Emma arrived together, their faces a tight web of false politeness and barely disguised hostility. The moment the door closed behind them, the tension seeped into the cracks of the walls, thick and electric. My heart was pounding, but my voice was steady when I greeted them. "Thank you for coming," I said, my eyes locking with Jake's. "We need to talk. About everything." They exchanged uneasy looks, but stayed silent. I reached for the thick folder resting on my side table and set it down deliberately. "You've been trying to erase me from this family, from my own life," I said, my voice firm, ready. "Today, I'm going to show you I'm still here, stronger than you imagined." I slid out the first papers, bank statements with suspicious transactions, pages marked with ink corrections, obvious forgeries, and letters from financial institutions confirming my suspicions. Jake's smile faltered, replaced by clenched teeth. "Mom," he started, voice tight, "this is ridiculous. You don't know what you're talking about." But I was just getting started. Next, I played recordings, captured conversations between Emma and a neighbor, whispering about managing Mom's affairs and making sure she doesn't get in the way. Emma's face paled, her eyes darting to Jake. "You're lying," she hissed. But the room held no mercy. One after another, witnesses came forward. The neighbor who heard raised voices late at night, the family friend who noticed the sudden absence of presents on birthdays. Each testimony stung like a fresh wound, but fueled my resolve. "You planned this," I said, voice low but steady. "Deceit, lies, manipulation, all to steal from me what I worked a lifetime for. I trusted you. You lied. I loved you. You betrayed." The room felt charged, every breath heavy with unsaid thoughts. For a fleeting moment, I felt the weight of years pressed down. But then, I straightened. "I'm not your victim to control. I'm Eleanor Roberts, your mother, your wife's mother, your grandmother, and I demand respect." Jake stood abruptly, anger flickering like a brittle flame. "You don't understand. We're doing this for your own good. You're confused, Mom." "Confused?" I repeated incredulously. Look at me and tell me if I look like I'm lost. I see everything clearly now. My voice resonated with the truth I had buried for months. The vulnerability I'd hidden behind smiles and gentle words had transformed into fierce power. Emma tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand. No more lies, no more secrets. This ends now. The confrontation cracked open the fragile facade. Tears welled in my eyes, not for loss, but for the strength reclaimed. You'll regret this, Emma spat, but it was weak, trembling with desperation. I already regret letting you get this far, I said softly but firmly. The police came after the evidence was presented. Witnesses testified. Jake and Emma faced legal consequences for their actions. As they were led away, I stood in the doorway, not with satisfaction or revenge, but with a profound mix of loss and hope. The battle was over, but the road to healing had only just begun. I looked back at the empty house, then out towards the rising sun. My heart was heavy, but soaring. I was free. Have you ever stood firm when everything was against you? Found strength you didn't know you had? This was my moment, and I'm still here. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, but inside me, a storm was raging. Today was the day everything would come to a head, the day I would face the darkest chapter of my life head on. No longer with fear or hesitation, but armed with truth and fierce determination. I sat quietly in my favorite chair, cupping a warm mug of tea, my hands steady despite the pounding of my heart. Memories from the past months, months of pain, doubt, and secret gathering of evidence, rushed through my mind. I thought of the trust I once held, the laughter of my children, and the sharp sting of betrayal that had replaced all of that. The sound of the doorbell snapped me back to the present. Jake and Emma arrived, their faces masks of polite civility. Their forced smiles and curt nods were thin veils over a deeper unease I could feel tingling in the air. As I led them into the living room, the atmosphere was charged but strangely solemn. This was not a gathering of a family. It was a reckoning. I opened the folder I had prepared, the fruits of my quiet battle. Thick with documents, recordings, photos, and witness testimonials, it was more than just evidence. It was my story, my voice reclaimed. "Thank you for coming," I began, steady and clear. "We're here because there are things that need to be said, things that can no longer be hidden behind lies or silence." I didn't give them a chance to respond. The papers came out one by one. Bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, letters with forged signatures, recordings of conversations where plans were whispered to isolate me and steal my belongings. Jake's jaw tightened, eyes flickering with an anger that was tinged with panic. Emma's lips pursed, failing to mask her discomfort. "You speak of lies," Jake hissed. "You don't understand what's really going on." But I was prepared. I played the recordings, voices cold and callous, plotting against me, mocking the woman who had raised them. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Emma's shallow breath. "You wanted to erase me," I said, my voice soft but resolute. "To take from me everything I earned. But it's not just about money. It's about respect, family, and dignity." Their silence spoke volumes. I continued, my hands steady as I laid out the timeline of betrayals, the missed calls, the disappearing visits, the vague excuses. "You painted me as weak, incapable, and confused. But standing here today, I am neither confused nor silent." Emma's voice broke through, bitter and sharp. "You're making this personal. You're tearing this family apart." I met her gaze without flinching. "No, Emma. What's tearing this family apart is the truth coming to light. It's the lies you chose to live with." Tears stung my eyes, not for the pain of others, but for the courage I found within myself. "Let me ask you something," I said, voice rising with conviction. "When did love turn into greed? When did family become a battlefield for control?" Jake's face flushed red. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand more than you think, I replied, and I'm done watching silently. The confrontation escalated with raw honesty, fury, and heartbreaking admissions. Emma and Jake tried to defend themselves, but there was no solace in their words anymore. It was a moment of release and reckoning, not just for them, but for me. For years, I carried the weight of denial and hope. Now, I carried the strength of truth. When the authorities arrived, it felt like the closing of an exhausting chapter. Jake and Emma faced the consequences they could no longer evade. As the door closed behind them, I stood firm, rooted in my regained power. But victory was bittersweet. The house was filled with quiet emptiness, memories lingering like ghosts. That night, alone in my living room, I allowed myself to cry, tears of sorrow, relief, and newfound hope. Have you ever felt the weight of betrayal so heavy, yet found the courage to rise? That is my story. Now I look forward, toward healing, self-love, and a future built on strength and truth. After the storm of confrontation and legal battles, a fragile peace settled over my life. The house that had once felt like a prison started to feel like a home again, a place where I could finally breathe without fear or suspicion. I spent the first nights alone in the quiet, feeling the weight of what had been lost, but also the strength I had gained. The silence of the emptied rooms whispered stories of pain and resilience, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly free. The legal process took its course, with Jake and Emma facing the consequences of their actions. Justice wasn't easy or neat. It came with complicated feelings of sorrow and regret, but it came. And that was enough to begin healing. Friends and neighbors, once unsure, now reached out with warmth and support. I rebuilt my life slowly, embracing new routines and reconnecting with the joys I had put aside. Gardening, reading, and simple walks became my therapy. I surrounded myself with people who respected and loved me for who I was. But the emotional scars ran deep. I often caught myself staring at old photographs, wondering how we had come so far apart. Trust, once broken, is not easily mended. Yet I knew forgiveness wasn't about neglecting the past. It was about freeing myself from its chains. One afternoon, Lily came to visit. She wrapped her small arms around me, her innocent smile reminding me why I fought so hard. "Grandma," she said softly, "I'm glad you're happy again." That happiness was a journey, not a destination. It came day by day, decision by decision, to choose strength over bitterness. I found purpose in helping others facing similar battles. Volunteer groups, support networks for elder abuse victims. They became a part of my story and a beacon of hope for others. Looking back, I realized this story isn't just about betrayal or loss. It's about the power of standing firm, the courage in reclaiming one's voice, and the resilience born from pain. To those watching, I ask, have you ever faced a moment when your world fell apart, only to find strength you never knew you had? If you're in that moment now, know this: you are not alone. There is hope, there is light beyond the darkness. My story is proof. I am proof. And as I close this chapter, I do so with a heart full of hope and a spirit unbroken. Thank you for listening. Please share your own stories, your own battles, in the comments below. Together we heal. Together we rise.